Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today I will be talking about Season 3, Episode 21, Guest for Breakfast, starring Joan Tetzel as Eve, Scott McCay as Jordan, and Richard Shepard as Chester. And this is a solid, perfectly acceptable, and entertaining episode in my opinion. It flows pretty well, and there's an interesting dynamic between all three characters in the episode. I don't think this is a great episode, however. It does feel a little over the top in places and a little bit stagey, but overall, it's a solid and fairly fast-paced episode. So, we start with a couple, Eve and Jordan, and they're having breakfast. They're also arguing a lot. This is eventually interrupted when the doorbell rings, so Eve goes to answer it without checking who it is, which is a mistake, as there's a man at the door with a gun who just kind of barges his way in, and we find out his name is Chester, and he's on the run from the police. We find out more about that as the episode goes on. So eventually Jordan comes into the room, and this creates kind of an awkward situation. But eventually Jordan sees the man has a weapon and means business. So they go into the kitchen, and Jordan comes up with a reason eventually to try and leave. He says he has to go to work, and if he doesn't, people will be suspicious. So he tries to convince Chester to let him go. Then he also tries to make kind of a joke or maybe a jab at Chester, and this doesn't this doesn't work out too well. Chester gets really mad. The Chester character is somewhat effective, but he was over a little bit over the top in a few scenes, for my taste. But he works in the context of the episode, I suppose. So eventually, Jordan is going to be let leave. He convinces Chester he should be able to leave. But, Chester tells him, you have to come back home alone. If I see any police or anything, I'll kill your wife. So at this point, Eve tells Chester Jordan won't come back. He's been wanting to get rid of me for a while now, and this is a good way for him to do it. So this creates kind of an interesting dynamic where, even Jordan might not really care what happens to the other one, which puts Chester in an awkward situation. He can't really use either one for leverage. I thought this was kind of a clever and interesting setup, although I thought a little bit more could have been done with it, but I'll get into more of that towards the end of the episode. So eventually, Chester tells Jordan to call in sick to work, which he does. We also find out that at this point that Chester killed his wife and her lover, and that's why he's on the run. And it's hinted at that Jordan's also having an affair in this episode, so this makes Chester not like him even more. So at this point, Chester decides he's going to leave as he's getting kind of annoyed. So his plan is to take one of them and leave the other one behind, who he's going to kill, so that they won't call the police. So at this point, Eve and Jordan both make their cases to go with him, and I guess they both have a good point, depending whose point of view you're looking at. Eve says you'll be able to get around the police better with a woman with you, and Jordan basically says she doesn't drive, so what's going to happen when you're tired? I thought both of these arguments were fine. So eventually Chester decides he'll take his chances with Eve, but then this argument about money comes up where Jordan says you're going to need money to go, and I can offer you a lot more money. So now Chester's undecided again. Eventually they go upstairs where this money is supposed to be, and at this point Jordan kind of runs off really quick. He kind of tricks Chester, who's admittedly not the smartest Alfred Hitchcock Presents character. So he runs into the room and barricades the door. At this time, Chester gets mad. He blames Eve. He says, this is all your fault. And he starts choking her. This was surprisingly pretty violent, especially considering when this aired on TV. But it did make Chester seem more menacing, so I thought it was okay. So at this point, Chester goes back down with Eve. He's still being pretty rough with her. There's a fight, and Jordan ultimately wins. This scene was a little abrupt and wasn't the most convincing in the world, but it worked to move the story forward. So at this point, I think Chester is taken away. They don't really show it, but Jordan mentions the police were there, so I'm guessing this is what happened. So at this point, even Jordan start bickering again, but eventually they start questioning how each other reacted, and Eve breaks down and cries, and all of a sudden, kind of out of nowhere, Jordan starts acting nicer. But it's kind of an interesting dynamic between the characters, and it works pretty well. I just thought it could have been explored a little bit more. But overall, Guest for Breakfast is a solid episode. It's enjoyable and entertaining for the most part, and I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. And overall, I do recommend this episode, at least as a one-time watch for fans of the show. It's pretty interesting. So 3 out of 5 for Guest for Breakfast, and as always, thank you very much for watching.